You're watching the Financial Sense News Hour. Financial news for high net worth investors and strategists. When it comes to the biggest investment trends and understanding the market, we've been delivering the insights you need for over 30 years.
Well, we are in a new age of nanotechnology, and graphene is powering this new age. One of the companies leading the charge is called HydroGraph. We're joined today with Kjirstin Breure. She's the president and CEO of HydroGraph. The website is hydrograph.com. Kjirstin, thank you for joining us again.
And thank you so much for having me.
So we spoke earlier this year, and it's been an exciting time for your company. Certainly just looking at the stock, it's been pretty explosive, which, of course, you use an explosive technology for creating graphene, which we'll discuss a little bit today. But before we do so, maybe let's start off talking about what makes graphene such a powerful material.
Right, and that's always a good place to start. So graphene is, of course, just one atomic layer of carbon atoms. You can imagine graphite as billions and billions of layers of graphene. And just due to quantum mechanics, once you get down to the nanoscale, we see that materials behave in a different way. I think that, science is still really uncovering why exactly that takes place. But with graphene, we know that at least at the lab scale, it is the strongest and most conductive material that's ever been discovered. So more conductivity than copper, harder than a diamond, stronger than steel, all of these really superlative qualities. And really what it comes down to is, the quality of graphene that you're able to access, how you're going to process it, and then the host material that it's going to positively improve.
So as you said, strongest and most conductive material on the planet. And as you told us last time, you're basically adding instructions to these materials at the atomic level, which is very fascinating. And if you wouldn't mind, one thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is when you talk about the various ages, and we think about the silicon age, of course, with computation based on silicon, and now how we're moving into, as you believe, the graphene age.
That's correct. And so even though it sounds like a disruptive technology, it's really not very disruptive because graphene being comprised purely of carbon, it plays very well with every other material. So it works well with other carbon materials, other nanomaterials, of course, also legacy materials. We can use it to reduce our reliance on rare earths. And really, because it's a 2D material, and this is kind of an odd concept to wrap your head around, but being two-dimensional, you're not going to use something 2D really on its own. You want to put that into a three-dimensional matrix. So that means a very, very small amount of graphene, often 0.01% or even less, can really fundamentally alter material properties.
Okay, you just said something that piqued my interest there. You said it can reduce our dependence on rare earths, because that has obviously been in the news a lot, especially if you consider what's happening with US and China right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I would say that this is something, we don't have internal data on this, but this is something that keeps popping up in the literature. We can put a coating, for example, on copper to improve the conductivity. We can use it to improve lithium. We can use it to improve a lot of these rare minerals that we really need, of course, strategically to reduce our reliance on. And when we look at the Chinese graphite export controls, for us having it's, of course, not a one-to-one. Graphene has different properties, mostly superior properties as compared to graphite. But for a company like us, we have the ability to synthetically produce however much we might need because, we start with acetylene, but that's really derived from methane. And there's abundant methane just in the US alone that we would be able to produce really unlimited quantities of graphene should we need to use it as compared to graphite or to improve graphite. And that really would depend on the application.
Got it. So as you're saying, you can apply graphene into these different materials, like you said, if that is copper, lithium, that will reduce our need to have as much of those rare earth metals and materials that you'd normally need otherwise because of graphene's properties, essentially.
Exactly.
So that is a very powerful material. And of course, the U.S. is racing to do everything it can to reduce its dependence on, China for a lot of those rare earths with the export restrictions and trade escalations along that. So graphene playing a key role. That was not something I had in mind with today's conversation, but that is an interesting aspect of all of this. Let's talk about what makes HydroGraph's graphene different from others? This was something that we got into a little bit last time with you, but there's a big difference between high purity graphene and perhaps purified graphite. Can you tell us about some of those differences?
Exactly. This is probably my favorite topic because I feel it's not very well understood. And for one, I would say that, I never want it to seem that I'm, speaking poorly of our competitors. I don't really view them as competitors because there's so much space in this industry for all of us. But really, it is very important to understand really what is the definition of graphene. Everyone talks about carbon content. A diamond is pure carbon, so is graphite. That does not have nanomaterial properties. When you get down to the nanoscale, really what defines that for graphene is what we call sp2 bonding. And that's really what gives us that two-dimensional aspect, that honeycomb sheet lattice structure that we see. If it's sp3 bonding, you're going to have maybe an acetylene black or graphite. It is a different structure with how those electrons are oriented. And what I find is that in the industry, a lot of these companies don't disclose their sp2 bonding, or it doesn't really hold up once it's characterized, which is really, the technical aspect of how you're looking at a material. For us, every single time we turn on the reactor, it is sp2 bonded graphene, which means every single particle we have is graphene. A lot of these companies, they have maybe most of it's graphene, but a lot of it's graphite powder, or a lot of it is really just an impurity or something that's polluting that electronic structure. And really what you want is, if you imagine these tiny flakes, for example, that we have, and we're very nanoscale, you want to have the lattice, that honeycomb structure, intact, because that's what gives us the mechanical strength, and that's what allows that electron to kind of shoot across the lattice. If there's an impurity wedged in the middle of that lattice, the electron gets stopped, if you can imagine it like that. So you don't want any holes in the lattice, and you don't want any other impurities. So while carbon content is important, the more important thing to discuss is sp2 bonding, because we see really more and more, or I guess I shouldn't say it like that. We've always seen it in the industry, and it's not something that's improving, is that there's a lot of graphite powder that's being sold as graphene.
Okay, and so like you said, sp2 bonding, that refers to the specific way in which carbon atoms form the chemical bonds in that honeycomb two-dimensional lattice structure. So that's what's key to many of these unique properties that graphene possesses. And so your company, HydroGraph, is able to produce, and I'm just looking on the investor presentation here, the highest purity, highest performing graphene on the market. And that's because of the process they use. Can you tell us a little bit more about this patented process?
Yes, so this is not my discovery. This is from the brilliant Dr. Sorensen. He was a physicist out of Kansas State University, now professor emeritus, but he has really been, I would say, studying these detonation synthesis processes likely since the early 2000s. He's done, a number of experiments. He was really trying to make an aerosol gel, so really kind of making a puff of smoke gel. So he did do that in our case, but it didn't go in a way that he expected. So he had this black fluffy powder, and this happened back in 2013. He applied for the patent in 2014, and he realized under a scanning electron microscope that it was pristine graphene. And kind of the humor in it, at least for us internally, this was at the peak of the graphene hype cycle. So everyone was talking about monolayer, and he thought, oh, well, maybe what I've made is crap. And now we have abundant data. Most of it we can't disclose yet, but as soon as we get confirmation that we're able to, we will continue to share this data, that we are using 10 to 100 times less of our graphene as compared to our competitors, really because it is so much more powerful. And we believe that it's because it's real graphene. It's fully sp2 bonded, and it's very, very high purity.
So this discovery was made by accident.
In a way, we like to say that it was very serendipitous. And so this happened at Kansas State University. The patent was eventually granted in 2016. HydroGraph, which was previously called Carbon 2D, was formed in 2017, really to commercialize that technology. And, we're now producing tonnage amounts every year. We're going to be building a very large production facility in Texas. The location we'll be disclosing soon, that will be capable of producing hundreds of tons as soon as the end of 2026.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the applications to various industries. I mean, I'm just looking at your website. There's so many different areas. It seems like it's limitless in terms of all the different things that it can touch and improve upon. Can you just give us a taste of some of those?
Sure. So, what we see a lot of interest in, we have a pretty wide variety of companies that we work with. We are very focused on composites and coatings, though we don't say no when companies like Hawkeye Biomedical, who we've been working with for years, have produced a biosensor that can detect lung cancer sooner than any other test on the market. So, in some ways, this technology would not exist without our graphene. We are really the enabling technology because we make it much more sensitive to detect what they need to really create this biosensor. But mostly where we find interest is in these heavily engineered fibers. So, for example, a nylon PA6, a PEEK, a carbon fiber. This is also where we see a lot of interest in defense industries, both from the US military and from adjacent companies. But we also see, and I think this is really what's going to be growing more and more throughout 2026, is with energy. So this would be everything from different battery types, which would include, supercapacitors, modular energy generation reactors, and a lot of the adjacent technologies that might go along with that. We could, look at cloaking, coatings for the military. We can look at thermal signature properties for different applications, and also EMI shielding to really protect our electronic components, both for automotive uses, for military uses, and aerospace.
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned last time that we're fairly new into the commercialization process of graphene. It was discovered in 2004, I understand. And I mean, if you think about silicon, it took about 50 to 60 years to be commercialized. So, I mean, we're really, 20 years into this process. Things are moving a lot quicker now. But I mean, I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Oh, absolutely. I really, I have mentioned in the past that it's kind of like silicon and how silicon really enabled this computing revolution. But graphene is so much more versatile than that. You can put graphene in anything you can imagine. So, in a sense, it's almost like petroleum. And so, I think it will be really in everything. And I think the next 5 years are going to be very interesting for the industry. I think it's still very early, all things considered, for graphene companies. Very likely, a huge amount of consolidation will still happen within the industry because there are many graphene companies. I think it will probably only be a handful that will survive the next 4 to 5 years. But once we hit 2030, I think we will be fully commercial. I think this will be in a multitude of products, and it will really only grow really from that point on.
Yeah, and there's so many different areas that we could discuss. Desalination, graphene playing a huge role, like you said, with composites and reducing the amount of material that's used. There's so many different applications. One of the areas that I found really interesting is with EV batteries and just material science around batteries, because adding graphene makes the charging cycle much shorter, and it also lengthens the time that a battery can last for. So if you're talking about, of course, an electric vehicle, I mean, boy, you could have average, let's say, range on a vehicle, 200, 300 miles. You add graphene to it, suddenly you're now 500 miles. And maybe years down the road, we could be talking about thousands of miles just on a single battery.
Exactly. And so, when we look at lithium ion batteries, of course, that's a technology that's been around for a long time, and it's kind of tricky because if you add too much silicon particles to these batteries, it becomes a little bit unstable, and then you lose that longevity. So we are all very optimistic that graphene can be, either a replacement or addition to some of these other nanomaterials. And exactly to your point, increasing capacity is fantastic, but actually increasing charge acceptance is what a lot of people are really looking for, because you don't want to be waiting, hours or even half an hour for your car to be charging. The faster that we can make that happen, the closer we can get it to, filling up at a gas station is really ideal for a lot of people. And I think that we will be making strides with capacity to give that longer range as well.
Looking at your investor presentation that just came out this month, and I'll have a link out to it as well for any of you listening that would like to take a look at this. You do talk about, this is interesting, a relationship or either some type of affiliation that you have. Maybe you tell us a little bit more about that. A strategic partnership, I should say, with the Graphene Engineering Innovation Center. This is out of the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about what is happening there?
Sure. So this, I would say, is really our biggest catalyst towards commercialization. We joined in the beginning of 2020, or 2024, sorry. And so we have a private lab there with PhD scientists that are working on really a lot of these projects that are very confidential to HydroGraph. But it's important to note that this is a huge hotspot for customers all over the world. So global automotive companies, global plastics companies, you name it, to really go to, because they can speak with the staff of the Geek, and the staff has direct firsthand experience working with most of the commercially available graphenes. So they can then promote or really select the right graphene for the right project. And because we have such promising performance, we have been selected for many of those projects, and we have performed very, very well. So for us, it's a fantastic system. Of course, being government affiliated, they're really under mandate to choose the best performing graphene for every project. And we really love it, especially when they benchmark us against other graphenes. Even if we don't know where the graphene came from, it's always a good data point to know how we're stacking up. So really, because of the reputation, I would say, that we have generated at this facility, that has been a big catalyst because we were actually introduced to the US military through the Geek, which is a funny thing that it took us going to the UK to get that introduction moving as quickly as it had. And now they're in discussions with creating a domestic Geek here in the US, which we know very little information on. We're told will play a pretty important role in, but we are eagerly anticipating their update.
Got it. Okay. So, and again, that's the University of Manchester Graphene Engineering Innovation Center. But as you said, it goes by the Geek, which is very funny. I didn't realize that. Yeah, so interesting, and that's really cool. So basically, you have this strategic relationship with the Geek in UK, where you have a private lab, as I understand it, there, and allowing your product, this highest purity graphene, on the market to be used for all these different applications, testing it, and then from there, that's where you see contracts that can potentially be developed with various companies and industries.
Exactly.
That's exciting. That's exciting. And last time we did discuss with you how you had just entered into a purchase agreement. This was earlier this year, again, with a company. I believe you had said that these were for technical fibers. There were civilian, military, aerospace applications from this. Can you just get us up to speed where things are at in terms of some of the contracts or agreements that you have with companies or various industries currently?
Sure. So this is really one of our largest areas. We have a huge amount of our pipeline devoted to these engineering fibers, and this is tied to multiple customers. And what we see now, because we are in the midst of these much larger scale-up orders with some of these customers, really kind of the trick here is, because graphene is new, we're still kind of compiling these user manuals, if you will, on how to process it. So we have amazing results in the lab. We have amazing results with our compounders, but teaching people how to do this at their site, it is very easy to get a little bit of a delay there, just because there's so many ways to adjust these pieces of equipment. There's so many ways to process. Every customer has a slightly different formulation and slightly different equipment. And it's really going through that process with each customer to make sure that we know exactly the right way for them to configure their process and their equipment. That's the process we're in now. We have more and more data now than ever. So very soon we will kind of have a definitive manual on what to do and what not to do. As you can imagine, that comes with a little bit of trial and error. And we are anticipating first contracts to come really throughout 2026, possibly this year. But I think just because the processing is a little bit of a learning curve, it's more likely next year.
And when you're talking about, again, you said the process it's the patented explosion synthesis process. Where does that take place? Where are you actually producing the graphene currently? Is that in the UK, like you said, or is it entirely within the US?
This is good to clarify. So currently in Manhattan, Kansas, which is, as you can imagine, a very small territory. And that's because Dr. Sorensen had developed this patent out of Kansas State University. And we kind of poached the top talent associated with the patent. And we started our first facility there just to really get this pilot scale facility off the ground. Because we're going to need to grow as a company. We've had to move to a much larger city. with better access to talent. So our new headquarters is going to be in Austin. Austin is kind of an interesting headquarters because while we will have a strong corporate presence and continue to build the team there, we will have some room for continued R&D and innovation on the reactors and on new graphene types. But we will also have a kind of control room in Austin where we will have computer screens monitor any future facilities. So, for example, we are building a large-scale production facility elsewhere in Texas, much closer to Houston, but Austin will really be controlling that facility with remote operation, and we'll have a relatively small staff just outside of the Houston location.
Okay. And again, I think as you said last time, I mean, you're just adding oxygen and acetylene into these chambers. It's a controlled explosion, but a very large explosion. And through this process, you're getting very high purity crystallized graphene, right? So that's kind of the process.
Exactly. It sounds a little bit more terrifying than it is. You don't even really hear anything. It's kind of a pop sound in this very, very thick carbon chamber. And again, safety is extremely important to us. We've never had an accident, but we are really looking forward to moving to the pipeline because once we have access to an acetylene pipeline, we have a number of safety improvements really involved with a flow rate for the acetylene that will not only potentially improve the quality of our graphene by increasing the purity, but again, there's a number of safety improvements that we'll be able to implement in this large-scale facility.
And obviously, oxygen is abundant, so that's one of the sources for this process. Acetylene being the other one. I know acetylene is produced in China with coal-based chemical industries. That's part of the process of producing acetylene. Is there an attempt to not use Chinese sources? Do you have non-Chinese sources? Because, again, if we're trying to move away from our dependence on rare earths from China, of which they have a monopoly and stranglehold on, clearly, if this is part of the feedstock, you would hope that you wouldn't be relying on China for that acetylene as well.
Exactly. So with the pipeline, we are purchasing or will be purchasing acetylene produced in the U.S., in Texas specifically. We're getting clarity on this right now, but we believe all of our supply chain is U.S. based, and we do put a huge amount of effort towards that. So while we don't have absolute clarity on all of our vendors, really to the best of our ability, we select American vendors. So acetylene would be the same. In the U.S., it's usually either methane cracking or produced via calcium carbide, so it's a chemical reaction. But regardless, as we grow, we will always make an effort there.
All right. Well, great. Well, Kjirstin, as we close, anything that we didn't discuss today regarding the process, the importance of graphene that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
No, I think we've covered the important topics. The only other thing that I would note is that just yesterday we crossed more sustainably the $1 billion threshold in Canada. So we're now officially a $1 billion company in Canada. And with all of this momentum, we are still seeking a redomicile to the US, and we will be moving to NASDAQ throughout the beginning of 2026. So we'll be providing shareholders with more clarity on our plan there soon.
Oh, well, that's exciting. Well, again, the company is HydroGraph. And if any of our listeners would like to find out more, I will have, again, a link to the presentation for all of you listening or watching if you'd like to access that. But what would be the best way for our listeners to get in contact or find out more?
We have a web form. So if you reach it on the web form, we can connect any listener to the right third party.
All right, great. Well, Kjirstin, it was a pleasure to speak with you again, and best of luck. I wish more success, and it sounds like it's going to be an exciting time through 2026 with some of the things that you discussed with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time.
All right, take care, Kjirstin.
Thanks. You too.